I have this grand plan of becoming a better photographer, especially for my landscape work, something I've spoken about in one of my previous videos. And part of that journey, well, that is to spend more time with my own images and try and figure out why some work and some don't. Simply put, I've started analyzing and critiquing my own photography. And to do so, I have quite a simple framework that I would like to share with you today. You see, years ago I took an evening class in photography. And I don't remember too much from that class today, but I do remember one thing the teacher said that kind of stuck with me. And he said that every image consists of 3 parts. You have the subject, you have the composition, and you have the technical aspects of an image. And each of these parts can be improved on and analyzed. That's exactly how I go about analyzing my own photography. I break it down to those 3 parts. And I thought we would look at a few of my images and see how it works in practice. And all the images we will look at in this video are darkroom prints. They are on 8x10 paper and they are early drafts. That's kind of how I like to go about printing nowadays. I make the best print I can in a single darkroom session, and then I pin the kind of draft print to a board right next to my computer monitor, so that I'm forced to view that image quite often and analyze that. And with that said, let's look at a few images. And we're going to start off quite strong. This is actually one of my favorite prints of late, and it kind of surprised me. We have as a subject this birch tree here, quite well defined, standing in this sea of smaller fir trees. I do think it's quite strong, nicely defined subject, and I do think it works quite well as such. Compositionally speaking, well, the tree roughly sits on the third of the frame here. It's the brightest part and it's most contrasty, so your eye naturally gravitates towards that, so that works quite well. It's also important to note is that the highlight of the tree faces inwards the image, help directing the eye towards the main frame of the whole image here. Also note that the shadow area here is quite dark, it's almost black. I do think it is actually all black here. And that acts as a visual block so you don't fall off the image towards this side. The second brightest part of the image is the smaller fir trees here. So eye kind of lands here and then start to explore this area here and moving on, and you can start looking at the, well, dark woodland in the background, and I do think that works quite well. I do have 2 small little issues, compositionally speaking. The first are the foreground twigs coming in from the sides here. I do think they add a bit of depth and interest, but they might also be a tad too distracting. Luckily, they are quite dark, so I do think it just about works, and I do think they benefit the scene and kind of add a bit of mystery and depth to the scene. My other little issue is the highlight area up here. I do like the general area here being a bit brighter because it kind of mirrors my highlight area here, but the very top left might just be a tad too bright. Technically speaking, well, this was shot with my Hasselblad and the standard lens at f8, f11, middle of the road aperture. The tree and everything onwards is nice and sharp, and the foreground elements with the twigs here are slightly out of focus, which I do think works quite well. A little side note is that when I took this image, I needed to be quite high with the tripod to get the framing that I wanted. And on my Hasselblad, I only have a waist level finder, so I couldn't see it on top of the tripod, so I had to rotate it 90 degrees to be able to see the finder, and then kind of rotate it back and mount it to the tripod. So there was some guesswork going on, and I did take a few exposures of this scene just to make sure that I got it as I wanted. And I might actually return to those other negatives, because there are some motion blur in the twigs here, as well as here. At first I thought they were quite nice, helping softening those off even more. But I'll have a look at the other negatives to make sure this is the best rendition of the image. And from printing, well, it's fairly straightforward. The only thing I did was I did add a bit of burn to this part of the image here to help directing the eye towards this area here. But I think I slightly overdid it because this is quite dark. It's kind of just this big black blob here, and I don't find that very attractive. So on the next go around in the darkroom, I'll try and lighten that up slightly to get some details back there. But even so, even as it stands, I think this is quite a nice print. When I do the final print, I might also try and add a bit of toning, some sienna toning, just to add a bit of warmth to the highlights there. But overall, I'm quite happy with this print. Moving on, we have this one. Another woodland scene, and a quite nice image, if I say so myself. But unlike the first image, this doesn't have a clearly defined singular subject. Instead, it is a photograph of a messy woodland. And it can be quite interesting to do images that doesn't really have one standout subject. To illustrate this, I'm thinking of Andreas Gursky and his two very famous images, Rain 2 as well as 99 Cent. Rain 2 is a very calm, very technically perfect, nice image. And 99 Cent, well, it's incredibly busy, yet somehow it feels controlled and calm. And I do think these illustrates my point by an image not needing a singular standout subject quite well. Rain 2, you could argue that the river that gives the photograph its name is the main subject. But on both of these images, I do think the whole scene and the flow of the scene are what the image is about. Especially on the 99 Cent, which I feel is the more impressive of the two. It is very busy, yet it's so masterfully controlled and balanced. And that's not an easy feast to achieve. And moving back to my image, always a good idea to show one of the greats just before your own photographs. It humbles one. On my image here, we don't have one clear defined subject. You could argue that the tree going across here might be the main subject because that's the first thing you notice. But to me, this is more of a visual gateway into the image. This image is more about the whole scene there. And as such, composition becomes very important and defining the right balance. And I do think it works quite well on this image. In the center we have these quite dark trees here. They act as a center anchor for the image so it doesn't tip over on either side. And they are surrounded by lighter trees and smaller twigs, which creates a nice sense of balance. Quite interesting there because you quite often add a bit of vignette to help direct the viewer's eye towards the center. And here we have the opposite to help with the balance. My only small little problem with this image, compositionally speaking, is this area here. One, it is quite bright, so I kind of go there, and it doesn't really contain any interest here at all. I was toying with the idea to maybe crop the image, something like so, but I don't want to do that because we have these two trees here. First, I do think they are quite interesting, and I do think they add a bit of interest to that part of the image. More importantly, they are in this nice V shape, helping the viewers kind of direct back into the main part of the image. So I feel like these are that important that I don't want to crop them out. I also have a small little issue with some overlapping trees here, that and that. I think I just about got away with it. I do think there's just enough space there to make it work. And I couldn't really move over because when I framed this up, I was very careful with the trees here. And if I had fixed that issue there, I would have introduced bigger issues over here. So I do think this was the best frame I could achieve on that day. And overall, I am very happy with the general balance of this image. And technically, this image was shot with my Hasselblad and 250mm lens. And it has a nice sense of compression there. Well, not the lens, but the distance to the subject. It also gives me quite nice out of focus areas here that kind of helps with the foreground elements and adds a bit of interest there and a bit of depth to the image. It's also worth noting there are a bit of motion blur going on, which I actually think helps the image, mainly this top part here. The leaves here are shaking, but if they had been tack sharp, they might have been a bit distracting because they are very bright. So I am quite thankful that I had a bit of motion blur there. But there's one thing that kind of bothers me about this image. It took me a while before I realized it, and that is that this tree here, my gateway to the image, isn't quite sharp. There's some motion blur there. A visual itch like that can sometimes be quite interesting, but here I think it is a bit distracting. I do have a few more negatives of this scene because I did try and photograph it with a couple of different filters. So I have a look at the other negatives and see if I can find a better rendition of the scene. And if I can, this might become a portfolio image. As it stands, it's okay even with that motion blur, even though it bothers me. Moving on, we have this, an almost image. It has a very well-defined subject with the central tree here as our main subject. I have a few supporting subjects here in the background with these darker trees here, as well as all the leaves around this main subject. And I do think it's quite a nice, strong subject that works quite well. And compositionally, well, this is where it almost works. I like the overall balance of this image. I like the kind of 2/3 of the image being a bit lighter with the foreground here surrounding the main subject. And then we have the bit of darker background here with a very nice pattern with the dark woodlands here. So that works quite well to me. But there was something that felt wrong or off with this image, and it took me a while to realize what. But just as on our first image, where the shadow side of the tree acted as a visual block, the same thing is happening here on our main subject. This side of the tree is very dark, acting as a visual block. So what's happening is your eye gravitates towards this and kind of just goes off at that side, not really exploring this side. Once again, a visual itch like that can be interesting, but I don't think it works here. Not at all. So that is a shame. I was toying with the idea that I might want to crop it. So I might want to crop it something like that. But I think that doesn't quite work because we lose a bit of that repeating pattern and that nice distribution with the background here. So it's an almost when it comes to the composition. Compositionally, well, this was fairly simple. Once again, note a bit of out of focus areas here. Focus on the tree here and then everything beyond is sharp. And I do really like having a bit of unsharp foreground elements, even though it sometimes can feel like a cheap trick. And I might still be able to save this image if I'm able to lighten off that shadow in the darkroom. Well, that would have made this image a lot more pleasing. So we'll see if I'm able to do that in the darkroom. As it stands, this is close, but not quite there. And we have one final image to look at. Another woodland image. I do like my woodlands. As a subject, we have, well, these 4 trees here. That stands out quite nice against the background. And we have a supporting actor of this smaller little tree here, kind of counterbalancing these bigger trees here. And I do think the subject worked quite well. Compositionally, well, it's quite nice and a very calm, well-balanced image. The subjects, well, they are well distributed. And the supporting actor here kind of lands neatly on the third. You have a dark foreground here and then a lighter background here. That helps both center the eye and helps the subject to stand out a bit more. My only little issue is the top left corner here. That might just be a tad bright and a bit distracting. But besides that, I do think it works quite well, compositionally speaking. Technically, the exposure was easy, printing was not. Because this highlight area here in the background that was essential to the composition was very bright and hard to print. The solution? Split gray printing, my favorite way of going about doing my darkroom prints. So what I did was, well, with the low grade filter, I burnt in this area here, and that will primarily affect the highlights and leave the shadows. So I still retain some details in my main subjects here, so they aren't just silhouettes. And if I'll try and print it again, I might just darken down the top left corner here that kind of bothers me. But I must say, overall, I think this is a very calm, nice image, but it might be just a tad boring. And I am starting to wonder if it just needs a bit more room to breathe. That is another factor I am considering when reviewing my images. Some images just works better on a larger print, and some works really well on this kind of small 8x10, which I actually think is quite a nice format for a lot of prints, and they work quite well to frame and hang on the wall. But some images needs to be printed large. And I am wondering if printing this large might save this image from its boredom. We'll see about that. And that was the final image. Thank you for spending some time with me and my prints. And I hope you find this simple framework of breaking down images into those three aspects: subject, composition, and the technical might help you when you want to, well, analyze images a bit more structurally. With that said, if you happen to like my work and the images I produce, I do have some of my finished prints for sale on my webpage. Mostly it's my urban photography I have there, but there will be some landscape work soon enough. And now it's time to end the video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Take care and bye.